4 things that I'd avoid writing. And so these aren't overarching ideas like the last 6 things that like people tend to think is a good idea and it's deceptive. These are things that you may or may not stumble upon, and I would sort of recommend avoiding them if you do. But you may or may not come up with this idea. And so the first of these is I would avoid writing something that's radically novel, something that's radically new. So if you have the idea for a story that's just totally unlike anything else out there and totally new, it's going to be really hard to find an audience for that because it's just so different than what exists. And more useful would be if there's like a subgenre that you're a big reader in, and you have an idea for something in that subgenre that's really similar to the other things that people are writing, but like a little bit different. That's probably a really good thing to write. And so the woman who I mentioned earlier that I'm friends with, the romance writer, she writes in the werewolf, fated mate denied romance subgenre. And so these are romances with werewolves, you know, people who turn into wolves, and there's fated mates. And so there's people in it that are destined romantically to kind of pair off and be a romantic couple. And the idea with her, with the denied, is that even though a couple are fated to be together, there's some problem and they don't get together, so they're not able to fulfill the destiny to kind of be together with one another. And so this is a subgenre of writing, of romance. And it turns out there are a ton of people who just can't get enough of these books. And it's very specific, but they just really want it. And every time there's a new book that comes out in this subgenre, they all buy it and read it. And so that's how this friend of mine got into it, is she was reading in this really specific subgenre. She had these ideas for these stories that nobody was doing that she really wanted to read. And so she said, well, if nobody else is going to write it, I will. And she wrote the first book with some of these ideas that she had in this kind of really ultra niche market. And immediately people were buying her books. And in really short order, she was selling enough books that she could leave her job working in a factory that she didn't really like. She had this kind of low-paying job in Wisconsin working at a factory, and she didn't like it. And she was able to just write these books and quite soon switch to full-time writing, which is massive success for writing. To be able to replace a full-time income with your writing is huge. And she did it unbelievably fast. And it was because she knew this subgenre so well. She knew what the readers wanted to read, and because she wanted to read it as well. And so she was able to write exactly what they wanted. And she did a 5-book series and was adding kind of other books to it. And she kind of fizzled out for one reason or another. She found that she wasn't having as much fun writing when she got kind of really deep into this, and it was a job, the demands of it. And she got a new job that she liked better, and she stopped writing. She hasn't published anything in 3 or 4 years now, and she's gone back to work. But she had a wild success, kind of the best success any writer could possibly ask for. And she wasn't writing anything new. She was writing something very similar to all of these other books in this really niche genre. I wrote kind of what I consider my first book. I wrote another book that I kind of lost faith in, and I kind of pulled it. And I wrote a urban fantasy novella where the protagonist is kind of an economist. He goes around making deals. He doesn't have any magic powers, but he goes around making deals with mythological creatures. And I wrote this urban fantasy novella, and it was pretty hard to get people to write it. And so then I wrote a nautical high fantasy, which is organized like a collection of short stories where the characters are the same in each of the short stories, and it's like a fantasy version of Star Trek. And again, a few people read it, but it was hard to get much interest. And these were really unusual books. They weren't like anything else. It's really hard for me for either of these books to say this is a lot like this other book, because there's nothing really the same out in the market. And because of that, it was really hard to find readers. I've most recently written my first lit RPG book, which, if you're familiar, it's called it's like a the lit stands for either literature or literary RPG, and it's a fantasy book typically. Some people have done science fiction books, but where the narrative includes game numbers and mechanics. And so the person might get a +2 sword, and it isn't like the sword of magic in the story. It's actually a +2 sword. And as they're fighting, their melee skill might improve. And that's something that'll be discussed in the narrative, that their melee skill improved from 13 to 14 as they were fighting the goblins or something like that. And this is a super hungry genre. There's a group of men that just cannot get enough of lit RPGs. And so I wrote Dimensional Traveler, a lit RPG book that I had an idea for. And immediately, the day I released it, people started buying it. And it's been probably my best seller out of all my fiction. And it's because it was similar enough to existing books that other people really liked, that I could kind of tap into the market and get the people who liked those other books to read mine as well. Before I started reading, I used to have the idea of writing a murder mystery where the investigator, kind of the Sherlock Holmes guy investigating the mystery, would be like unlikable. And so he'd be the protagonist, but he'd just be this unlikable person. The reader, he'd just be doing these things that the reader would kind of find annoying and dislikable. And now I'm glad I didn't spend any time writing that, because I know that few things torpedo a book faster than a reader saying, I just don't like the protagonist. You have to identify with the protagonist. You have to root for them and you have to like them. And maybe somebody who is a really, really strong writer could write a murder mystery with an unlikable protagonist, but it would be very hard to do. And I'm sure if I'd written that book, it would have been a really tough sell to get somebody to read it and engage with it. Um, Terry Brooks's Sword of Shannara always amazes me because it's so similar to Lord of the Rings. And it's not just like a Tolkien style fantasy work. You can match up characters from Lord of the Rings to Sword of Shannara, and you can match up events, and it's just a very similar book. You can really tell that he used Lord of the Rings as a template to write Sword of Shannara, but people love it. It was one of the big breakout fantasy novels that helped establish the genre in North America. Lester Del Rey was a huge booster of it, and he said this is the future of fantasy in America, and it helped him establish a fantasy imprint at the publisher that he worked at, and so it's huge. And so it's a lot like Lord of the Rings, but it worked out for it. It made it a really strong book that people really liked, and it really established him as an author, and was very popular. So rather than trying to think, if you ever are thinking like, oh, that's too similar to something that already exists, I wouldn't worry about that. You don't want to try to find something that's radically new, something totally different. You want to write what you've enjoyed and that people want to read more of. And so that's okay. You can't steal the characters and things that other authors have done, but cozying up to what somebody else has done and kind of using their work to sort of influence yours is actually probably a good idea. A much better idea than trying to do something totally different. You don't want to write fan fiction. And so fan fiction, probably most people know this, but it's where you write in a world that you don't own, that exists. So fan fiction really got popular, I think, with Star Trek back in the 60s. And so there were fanzines where people would write original Star Trek stories about the Star Trek characters in new situations. And nowadays, I think Harry Potter fan fiction is really popular, where people write their own adventures set in the world of Harry Potter. And I'm not making a moral or creative judgment on this. I'm not saying that people who write fan fiction are inferior writers, and I'm not saying that this is poor fiction. That it's I'm not making a judgment on it. There have definitely been successes that have come out of fan fiction, and so 50 Shades of Grey was originally written as a Twilight fan fiction, and so the two characters were the main characters from the Twilight saga, and this person wrote it as a fan fiction, and it started gaining some traction, and people joked that basically they just did a find and replace on the names, and then they released it, published it, and it became this huge juggernaut. People loved it. And so the Twilight relationship and the Twilight characters helped her write that book that was then wildly successful. Jim Bernheimer writes sort of superhero fiction, and he writes kind of sort of fantasy fiction. And he wrote over 1 million words of Harry Potter fan fiction before he started writing his own original work. And so he was heavily involved in some of these sites where people write fan fiction. And he had an audience who read his Harry Potter fan fiction when he was producing it. And then he started writing original work, and that audience came with him. So his fan fiction both helped him develop as a writer, and it helped him have an audience. The big issue I have with fan fiction is that it limits what you can do with it when you finish writing it. So you can't sell it. If you write Harry Potter fan fiction, you can't sell that. J.K. Rowling is going to sue you or threaten to sue you. And so you may get an audience, but you can't sell to that audience. Whereas if you built up something that was like Harry Potter, but was your own world and changed it in certain ways, then you can sell those books. And if one of them really takes off, if it's a big success, you'll be able to have control of that and sell the movie rights and take advantage of the good fortune of having a hit. Whereas if your Harry Potter fan fiction is a hit, that you can't really do much with that. There are public domain fan fictions if you really wanted to do fan fictions. And so Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is fan fiction of Jane Austen's book. And there's a study in Emerald, which Neil Gaiman wrote, which it's a Sherlock Holmes fan fiction where it incorporates Call of Cthulhu's type great old ones into a Sherlock Holmes world with like a big twist at the end. And, you could do that if you really want to do fan fiction, get something that's public domain and write fan fiction there. But what I highly recommend is if you want to do fan fiction, file off the serial numbers and make it your own. So don't write Harry Potter fan fiction, write, children at a magical academy having adventures, and J.K. Rowling doesn't own that. So you could have it at a Canadian school for witchcraft and wizardry, and you can have your own faculty there, and you can have your own adventures, and take the things that you find exciting and interesting about the franchise that you want to do the fan fiction for, and just make it a new version that you can then legally control and write and have kind of full legal and creative ownership of the ideas. So Kevin Crawford has done this with role-playing systems. His Godbound system is exalted with the serial numbers filed off. It doesn't use any of the terminology of exalted, and it's changed the mythology in the world a bit. But you're playing these godlike, massively overpowered characters in a setting that's very, very, very similar to Exalted. His Stars Without Number is Traveler with the serial numbers filed off. And so it's very, very, very similar to Traveler, but then it uses this old school kind of like basic Dungeons and Dragons style resolution in a Traveler universe. He recently made City Without Numbers, which is a cyberpunk system. So it's like Cyberpunk 2020 and Shadowrun, except he's removed all the elements that those companies owned, and he just offers a role-playing system that's in kind of that genre, that setting, without infringing on the people who kind of own official systems in that area. And so this is, to me, if you have any desire to do fan fiction, this is the way to approach it. If you just love the Planescape setting and you want to write fiction set in it, shift it around and make it your own and get it out of the Wizards of the Coast's owned Planescape setting and create your own setting that has kind of similar ideas to it. If you love Dark Sun and you want to have this dystopian fantasy world that's unbelievably harsh, just rework some of those ideas, move it away from the things that TSR owns, Wizard of the Coast owns, and make it a world that's similar to that, but that you could then write in. You can kind of make it your own and develop it as your own system. Um, some people, speaking of this, you might have the idea to write within an established role-playing game setting. So you might say, I want to write a Planescape novel. I want to write a Dark Sun novel. And you might contact Wizards of the Coast and say, hey, I want to write one of these novels for you. And getting kind of rights and permissions and agreement with a company to write in their world is a pain in the ass. And it's going to be extra hard if you don't have anything written, if it's going to be your first book, if you don't have any history of writing. And the company's going to be deeply, deeply skeptical that you're going to be able to write a worthwhile book in their setting. And it's just going to be so hard to get any traction. So if you want to do that, I strongly recommend you change things about the system so that it no longer is the system that that company owns, and then you can write something similar on your own. There's a guy, and I don't remember his name, but he wrote a whole Planescape novel, and he's a Canadian author. He's down in Kitchener, Waterloo area, and he wrote an entire Planescape novel just because he was so excited about the setting and everything. And then he went to TSR with this complete novel, and TSR said, we're not interested. And so he released it for free on the internet. He couldn't sell it. There was nothing he could do with this story that he'd created. I guess he wasn't able or willing to go back and change it enough to move it out of the Planescape setting. So, it's just a really kind of a waste of time for him. He couldn't do a lot of things with that book. He was really, really, really restricted because Wizards of the Coast, TSR, owns that intellectual property. I'm not saying this is impossible, though. A friend of a friend, a man who I knew during my undergraduate, was actually the person to write the very first licensed Diablo book. And so Diablo's the computer game system that they're on Diablo 4 now. And he wrote a book back in 2000, and it was the very first book set in the Diablo world. And I think it was the first book he ever published, and he was interested in writing. And somehow he got in touch with Blizzard and convinced them that he was the guy to write the first Diablo book for them, and he did it. So it's not impossible, but to me, it's just more trouble than it's worth. And if this is something that you wanted to do, I'd really just say file off the serial numbers, change it, make it a similar setting, but different enough that you're not going to get yourself in trouble. And nobody owns cyberpunk. A lot of different authors have written in the cyberpunk genre. Nobody owns cyberpunk with elves. Nobody owns dystopian fantasy desert world. And so these are things that you can do. You can write in these kinds of settings, even if it's not something that's owned by a company. And so that's absolutely what I'd recommend doing. You probably want to avoid writing with a gimmick. And so what I mean by this is you might have this idea, I'm going to write this book and it's going to be a fantasy book. And every time there's combat in the book, I'm going to model it in an RPG setting with the characters and the monsters with statistics. And I'm going to roll dice, and I'm going to let the dice decide what happens. And so then it's going to be this true to the RPG setting and true to the random probability with the dice actions. And then if somebody tries to climb a wall, I'm going to use a skill check. And so that'll determine whether they get up the wall or whether they fall and what happens with it, da 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 da. Or you might have this idea that I'm going to write a book and release it in chunks, and then readers are going to vote on what happens next. So it's going to be the readers are the protagonist, and they get to guide the actions, and they get to control what happens in the book as a group. Or I'm going to have a live play YouTube channel, and we're going to play games on that. And what happens in the book and what happens in the YouTube channel are going to be canon with one another. So whatever happens in one or the other is true in both worlds. And It's just all of these things are unlikely to give you a better, more engaging work. And you might kind of describe this and think, oh, this is this really exciting, neat idea behind a book. And it's just probably not going to get people as excited as you hope it will. And so in each of these cases, you're just better writing it yourself instead of all the overhead of this. So modeling the action and then letting the dice decide. You're just better narratively deciding whether the person manages to climb up the wall or whether they fall, and kind of which is more interesting for the story, as opposed to rolling the dice and the dice determining what happens. And the same with the other two. I think that people have ideas for things like this, and it just doesn't add as much to the story as you think it's going to. And I think that for writing your first book, it's probably just best to keep it more simple and down. Like with everything else here, you can ignore my advice later on. And if you've written a book or two and then you want to do something like this, power to you. But you might find just the writing some books first and building up that ability to write without kind of the gimmick will make you a stronger writer and would help you do a better job delivering on these things when and if you did that in the future.